Welcome to Sage for H, where we search for truth and meaning in global politics. Today, I have the honor to talk to Professor Justin Yifu Lin. Professor Lin is Dean of the Institute of New Structural Economics, Dean of the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development, and Professor and Honorary Dean of National School of Development at Peking University. Apart from that, Professor Lin was the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank between 2008 and 2012. Prior to this, Professor Lin served for 15 years as founding director and professor of the China Center for Economic Research at Peking University. He is also counselor of the State Council and a member of the Standing Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultation Conference. He is the author of more than 20 books, among them New Structural Economics, a framework for rethinking development and policy. Welcome, Professor Lin.
Thank you very much, John. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to have this dialogue.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really nice that you would like to participate. It would be a tremendous resource for our students as well at Malmö University. So thank you again.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So let us start with the questions then and see where we go from there. So in 2008, you were appointed as Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of the World Bank. And not only that, but you were also the first person from a developing country to serve as Chief Economist. You have stated that it was a sign of changing times. Could you please expound on what that change means, what this moment symbolized to you?
Well, yes. I was the ninth Chief Economist of the World Bank. And if you look into the history, the other 8 are all from the US or European country. And they are all masters in economics. And at the same time, quite a number of them have rich experiences in policy makings. And I can give just a few names, like Stiglitz. He was the Nobel laureate. He is the Nobel laureate in economics. He is also the chairman of Council of Economics to the president. And also Larry Summers. He is the Clark Medals winners. At the same time, he is also, later on, he became the Secretary of Treasury, and he's also the president of Harvard, and also the president of Central Bank and other things. And I'm from academics from the developing country. So it's a big change. And this is a very important position because the chief economist is the person in charge of development research, development policy at the World Bank. And the World Bank is one of the most important multilateral development institutions with a responsibility to guide the economic development in the developing world. So I think that, I was lucky to be appointed, and the appointment itself, is a important milestone in the developing world.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it must have been very exciting to enter those halls for the first time, representing an economist, an academic, a professor from a developing country. I mean, the emotions must have been something special, right?
Certainly, and I have a very strong sense of responsibility. As you mentioned, when I enter the hall of this administrative building of the World Bank, we can see a motto. Our dream is a world free of poverty. And that's the dream of the World Bank. And I think the dream of the developing country. Actually, that should be the dream of every country in the world.
Yeah.
And the World Bank, use that as the mandate. But we see poverty is still widespread in the world. So I do have a sense of responsibility, and I hope I can make a contribution to the realization of the dream.
Yeah, thank you very much. So let us continue, focusing a bit on your experience at the World Bank. So between 2008 and 2012, you in effect guided the intellectual leadership and shaped the economic research agenda of the World Bank. You have also stated that in order to meet the challenges of development, the institution had to be an agent of change. How should the World Bank be an agent of change, and is it living up to that?
Well, because if you want to really make a country to change from poverty to prosperity, then we need to help the country to have a structural transformation. Because we know when a country is poor, the majority of the people living in the countryside rely on agriculture for living. And at that stage, they are all poor, including your own country in the 19th century. Most people live on agriculture in the countryside. At that time, people were poor. And now, if a country wants to become prosperous, they will have to transform from an agrarian economy to modern industrialized economy. And if the World Bank wants to realize its mandate or its mission, a world free of poverty, then the World Bank should help the developing country to have this transformation, to have this change happen.
And do you think they are living up to that?
I think the World Bank has good intention. All my colleagues at the World Bank has good intention. And they also, have the power to, guide the developing country. But if you look now, the poverty is still widespread. And especially before I was appointed as the Chief Economist, we can look into the statistics. China started a transition from a planning economy to a market economy in 1978. And when I went to the World Bank 2008, that was 30 years after the transition. During those 30 years, more than 700 million people get out of the poverty. But if we took away those 700 million people get out of poverty in China away, the number of poor people in the world continue to rise. So that means the intention from the World Bank was good. People at the World Bank had the intention to help. And every developing country also has the aspiration to get rid of poverty. But the statistics show the mission is still too far away.
Is it are we able to diagnose what is the problem?
I think that the main reason was, as we said, they did not really help the developing country to generate decent jobs through the structural transformation we just mentioned. They did not really provide the decent jobs to the people without their own employment for income. And the reason why they did not succeed in providing this kind of decent job was they did not really help the developing country to have this structural transformation happen. We see, the industrialization in the developing world. We see all migration of the labor force from agriculture to the city, to the urban areas. But they were not employed in high productivity manufacturing job. They went to low productivity services. And sometimes those kind of productivity were not higher than the productivity in the agricultural sector in rural areas. And that was the reason why they could not improve their income. And they cannot, improve their income, and they're still trapped in poverty.
Okay, thank you very much for that elaboration. I have a number of questions, but I would like to focus a bit on Ethiopia, if it is okay. I can ask questions about that. That's okay?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so you have been officially honored for your work and awarded with a commemorative silver medal even for your contribution to the Ethiopian economy. And Ethiopia features in your scholarly work, and it formed a great part of your policy work at the World Bank and the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. As Chief Economist of the World Bank, you commissioned the Light Manufacturing in Africa study, which was the first research project from the bank based on your theory, New Structural Economics, and it used Ethiopia as a case study. The study was also officially launched in Ethiopia, and you have stated that the study was central to your legacy as Chief Economist and that it should be used as a guide for the transformation of Ethiopia's industrial structure. In some sense, given that you were trained at the University of Chicago, you can be compared to Milton Friedman and the Chicago boys and their focus on Chile, but you focus on Ethiopia. So why was Ethiopia so central to you and your work during your time at the World Bank? And what is so special with the Ethiopian economy?
Well, yes, thank you very much for this question. I was appointed as the Chief Economist of the World Bank in June 2008. And when I report to my work at the World Bank, I traveled to Africa in the first week of my appointment. And in the first week, I visited Ethiopia already. And the reason why I focused my work in Africa was because, as I mentioned, our mission is a world free of poverty. And we know Africa has the largest concentration of poverty. If we want to have a world free of poverty, then we need to help African country to become prosperous. That's one thing. And then secondly, Ethiopia at that time was one of the poorest countries in Africa, certainly also in the world. And Africa, Ethiopia is also a landlocked country. And they consider, the condition for development is unfavorable. So, and if I can help Ethiopia to transform, then other countries will be able to transform. And I think that, one of, if you look to the East Asia in the 1950s, 1960s were considered as least top region in the world. Because at that time, the understanding East Asian economies, they did not have resources, they were poor, they did not have the condition for development. But now East Asian country became the most dynamic growing country in the world. And many regions in the world, and many of them now, catch up with the high income country. They turn from low income to middle income to high income. And one reason East Asian economies were able to transform, I think Japan played a very positive role. It provides, the examples for a low-income country to transform, and to show it was possible to provide experiences and to inspire the people. So I think the African country, so far African country do not have a successful example. And if we can help Ethiopia to be successful, I think Ethiopia can provide the aspiration and also experiences for other countries in Africa. And that's the reason why, I spend a lot of my effort try to help African country, and certainly I hope Ethiopia can be a successful example country for others. And Ethiopia, its people, its government also has the aspiration to be successful. And that's the reason why I focus my work in Ethiopia.
Okay, so you mentioned that there is the problem of poverty is general to the African continent, but it's also very specific to Ethiopia, that it's very poor and it's also landlocked. But is there some, and then you mentioned that the Ethiopian people and the government has the aspiration to develop. Is there some other factor that is unique to Ethiopian economy or Ethiopian society that made you focus on Ethiopia?
Well, and certainly the government is very receptive to my ideas, and make me easier to work with them. They trust me. They understand I have the good heart, and they welcome me, and so I can talk to the senior leaders, the prime minister, the ministers, and they listen very carefully. And once they understand my recommendation, they put that recommendation into their practice. So it's much easier to work with the government in Ethiopia.
So you have built a very good relationship with the Ethiopian government over the years.
Right. Yeah.
Is there some political connection in the sense that Ethiopia also has a regime or a government that was previously Marxist, at least, and China is at least officially a communist state? Is there a connection among like-minded when it comes to Chinese officials and diplomats and academics, and Ethiopian officials, diplomats and academics?
Not so much, because they have a socialist regime before, because the government I work with was the government overthrew the socialist regime.
Yes,
so
but even
not, but there's something, because Ethiopia is the only African country which never been colonized. So they are very proud of their own culture. They are very proud of their own people. And they do have confidence that, they hope their country will be successful. And they do have those kind of devotion to their country. But I think that should be also similar to other countries, because every country, all the people are proud of their own country. And Ethiopia certainly, they are proud of their own country. But in a way, for me, I am lucky to have a government that receptive to the message that I advocate.
Yeah, that's very important, because otherwise, if no one is listening, how will they implement the policy recommendations?
Right. Very true.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. Let me see. Yeah. It seems to me, and you just expressed it now as well, that you view Ethiopia's adoption of your framework and its industrialization program as a success. why would you say that Ethiopia has been successful? What are some of the tangible changes we can observe in Ethiopia, and are they following your blueprint? The last question you already seem to have answered, that they do indeed follow your blueprint, or your take, at least heed your advice. But what are some of the tangible changes we can see in Ethiopia, and why is it a success?
Well, you can see, for example, look into different direct investment to Africa. And from 2013 to 2017, within those 5 years time, Ethiopia received the most foreign direct investment in African country in the manufacturing sectors. Certainly, there are some other countries. They're the number 4 in Africa, but the number 1 in manufacturing, because some other countries they receive foreign direct investment in mining, and mining requires huge investment. But in terms of manufacturing, Ethiopia was the number 1, and they in those 5 years time, and also not only in the foreign direct investment, more than 70% of the investment were in manufacturing. Certainly, they have some infrastructure investment, but more than 70% was manufacturing. But as I mentioned, manufacturing is very important because they develop labor-intensive industries, which can provide jobs, which are consistent with their competitive advantages, so they can export those kind of goods to the global markets. And that's how country can transform from an agrarian economy to the modern industrialized economy. And also they implement this kind of project very quickly. For example, they build up the industrial parks in Borodami, and they also build up the industrial park in Hawassa, and also in a very short period of time, quickly turn those kind of investment into the productive base. And those kind of investment also increase the government revenues. For example, in Hawassa, the local government's tax revenue more than quadruples after they set up these industrial parks. So those are all, the metrics to measure the success of their development.
Interesting. Thank you very much for specifying that. And you mentioned special economic zones. And I actually have a question about special economic zones. So I might as well ask that, if it's okay.
Very good.
Yeah. So why are special economic zones so important? Do they serve a pragmatic purpose of gradually introducing capitalism to planned economies? So you basically have to cross the river by touching the stones and proceed with caution and prudence? Or is there primarily an economic rationale in terms of clustering and streamlining economic activities within a given geographic space, or both perhaps?
I think the most important things, as I said, we need to have a structural transformation to turn from poverty to prosperities. And in a structural transformation from an agrarian economy to a modern industrialized economy, you need to improve the infrastructure, also institution, rich environment. Because in agrarian economies, certainly infrastructure is poor, and they do not have industrialized culture, and their business environment is not hospitable to industrial investment, both domestic or international. And all those things will be desirable to improve for the whole nation. Infrastructure improvement for the whole nation, institution improvement for the whole nation, business environment improvement for the whole nation. But those kind of improvement would require resources and the government implementation capacities. But we know resources and implementation capacity of our governments are limited. And So under the kind of situation, we need to prioritize the use of those kind of limited resources implementation capacities. And special economic zone would be a very good way to prioritize those kind of resources and capacity, especially to make the special economic zone for the investment of sector of the country, which the country has competitive advantages. Because if you use the special economic zone to support the development of the sectors, which the country has competitive advantages, you can immediately to make the sector very competitive internationally. Because competitive advantage only means the production cost, the factor cost of production will be low. That's the definition of competitive advantages. But if you want to be competitive in domestic market and international markets, it's a competition of total cost. Total cost also includes transaction cost. How high the transaction cost depends on how good your infrastructure, business environment, institution are. But as I mentioned, it would be almost infeasible to improve the institution for the whole nation, infrastructure for the whole nation. So you can, make the enclave of this special economic zone to have, sufficiently good infrastructure, business environment, institution, and to turn the sector which we have competitive advantages to be very competitive immediately. And that's what we observe in China, in East Asia, and also in Hawassa of Ethiopia or Boronami of Ethiopia. Once you can improve that immediately, then those kind of sector can booming immediately. And that is the pragmatic way to prioritize the use of resources in a developing country. And certainly cluster will be part of that. But the most important thing is to reduce the transaction cost for the sector which the country has comparative advantages. And once you have the successful economic zones, the government will get more resources and a confidence. And so they can extend that to other part of the country. And people will increase their confidence of their government also because they see the success there. And they know, this is the right way to do it. And then they will have, it certainly is a step by step. Each step seems to be small, but accumulatedly, the step can be, the speed can be very fast.
Is this thinking and this focus on economic zones something that you developed by observing China's own development?
Yes, I observed that based on the experiences in China, but it's also based on the experiences in other successful economies in East Asia, and also actually successful country in all the industrialized country. For example, industrialization in UK did not occur for the whole nation immediately. It started with the Manchester, a few cities, and once those kind of cities became successful, the government have more resources, and industrialization was spread to other parts of the country. So it's based on the experiences of the successful countries, including China.
I see, and that is perhaps where we have some scholars that differ from your perspective. And I have a question in relation to that, if that is okay to bring it up.
Certainly, go ahead.
So in his book, Kicking Away the Ladder, the Korean economist Ha-Joon Chang argues that all the major industrial powers pursued what we broadly could call mercantilist policies. And I would argue that we could include China here. But on the contrary, your theory of new structural economics is a neoclassical approach, emphasizing comparative advantage following industrial policy, whereas Ha-Joon Chang emphasized comparative advantage defying industrial policy. So why is your theory more compelling? And how do you reconcile China's development with your theory? I mean, state intervention, large state-owned enterprises, financial repression, investment ahead of demand, negative lists for negative list with prohibited and restricted markets, and so on and so on. And all of these aspects do not really seem to rhyme well with neoclassical theory, or does it?
This is a very big question. So
yeah, I know. Sorry.
Answer this step by step.
Yeah.
The first one, all the developing countries practiced the import substitution strategies, try to develop the capital-intensive industries after the Second World War. The socialist country, they adopt the Stalinist model that was very capital-intensive industries. In Latin America country and quite a number of African countries, they adopt import substitution strategies, also try to support the development of the capital-intensive industries. They all defile the competitive advantages, but they failed. Okay. And so the recipe for the success is not to defile the competitive advantages. Then we come into the experiences of East Asia. They have active government facilitation for the development of their industries. But if you look at the development industry, they started with very, very intensive industries, like in Korea. In 1960s, it was garment, textile, polywood, and wigs. Those are very labor intensive. And only after 10 years of those kind of labor intensive industry-oriented development, they accumulate capitals. So in the 1970s, they moved up later to the steel and shipbuilding. Okay, and after 10 years, by the time 1980s, they move up to the chemical industry. They move up to the chip and fabrication industries and so on. So yes, they are in the industrialization process, but they move up this step by step. They did not move to the most advanced industry immediately. And when they move up this kind of industries, those industries are consistent with their competitive advantages. But as I mentioned to you, when a sector are consistent with their competitive advantages only means the factor cost of production will be low enough to be competitive in the world. But the competition in the world is the total cost. The total cost, including the transaction cost, that based on the infrastructure and the institution and so on. And for the improvement of the infrastructure and the institutions, that rely on the government facilitation. And that's the reason why we see the successful country, they have efficient market or market economy to provide a price signal to the entrepreneurs, what kind of sector we have competitive advantages. And the factor cost of production can be low. However, they also need to have the government to facilitate that by improving the infrastructure and so on. And so, in fact, recently I tried to develop a theory called state-enabling trade theory. Because in the past, all the trade theory, including the Ricardo or Ha-Joon or Paul Krugman, they only talk about the production cost. But to be competitive, you need to be competitive in total cost. And the total cost very much rely on the government facilitation to reduce the transaction cost. If the government would not do those kind of facilitation, the competitive advantage will remain at a state or latent competitive advantages. You cannot become actual competitive advantages. So that is one area I differ from Ha-Joon in our debate. But at the end, Ha-Joon agreed with me, right? He said, well, you need to defy the competitive advantage, but you cannot be too ambitious. And actually, he recognized, certainly you need to turn, you need to identify the latent competitive advantage, which are not actual competitive advantage of the country now. And through the government facilitation, you turn those kind of latent comparative advantage become your actual comparative advantages. So at the end, I think that we do have some consensus. Okay. Talking about China, the reason why China has some kind of financial repression, it was because China was a transition economy. Before the transition in 1979, China built up a lot of capital-intensive industry, which went against China's comparative advantages. And the firms in those kind of sectors were not viable. There are two approaches. One was the shock therapy, for the government to remove all the distortions, like Eastern European country, former Soviet Union did. But since those kind of sectors went against China's comparative advantages, if we remove all the distortion or all the subsidies and so on, they will go bankrupt immediately. And then we are going to have a huge unemployment and social instability. Not only so, many of those kind of sectors were related to national security, national defense, and also the basic industry like power, like telecommunication. They were capital intensive. If the government did not give subsidy to them, they will go bankrupt. Then you can have economic operation in the country at the world. So under the kind of situation, a pragmatic approach was for China adopted. We use some kind of dual track approach in the transition. On the one hand, continued to provide some subsidies and protection to the industry inherited from the transition before the transition. Those kind of heavy industry, capital intensive industry, to maintain stability. But on the other hand, we liberalize entry into the sector which Chinese economy has comparative advantages, like in the labor intensive industry, because China was relatively abundant in labor force. And by this, we can have stability and dynamic economic growth simultaneously. And the way to protect and subsidize the labor intensive industry is because the capital intensive industry, the most important cost of production is cost of capital. That's the interest rate. And so to subsidize those kind of sector means we need to have some kind of financial repression in order to reduce the capital cost as a way to protect the older industries. So those kind of things you mentioned, the financial repression and a protection to the SOE and so on. Yes, they were there, but it was because China used the pragmatic approach to maintain stability in order to allow the sector which China has comparative advantage to grow dynamically. And the dynamic growth in the new sectors create a condition to reform the older sectors. Because as I mentioned, if the new sector grow very dynamically, they can accumulate capital very quickly. And then gradually, the older sector will turn from going against China's comparative advantage to become consistent with China's comparative advantages. Once they become consistent with China's comparative advantages, firms in those kind of sectors will be viable. By that time, the protection and subsidies will become unnecessary. Then the government can remove subsidies and protection and move close to the market economy. So I would say China today is very close to market economy. Most of those distortion has been removed.
Okay. I mean, just to say something in relation to Hyun Chang and then China, just briefly. I think Hyun Chang is arguing that you said that Korea went through these different development stages, but that these developing of these industries that you mentioned, they did not take place in a free market. They were protected, they were subsidized, and when they become competitive enough to be able to compete with global actors, protection, subsidies were lowered. So the whole assumption of a free market, I think, is the problem, and then that is also perhaps the critique against the neoclassical approach. What would you make of that?
Well, here's that, the quantitative difference will make qualitative difference, right? Yes, there are some protection and subsidies at the beginning, but the quantity is very small. And the quantity is very small because you need to provide incentive for the entrepreneur to do the innovation, to do the industrial upgrading. Because the innovation and industrial upgrading are risky. And they also have an externality to the follower. So you need to provide incentive to the first movers. And most of these protectional subsidies in Korea or in the industrial policy advocate are in the category of providing incentive to the first movers. And those kind of protection subsidies, in terms of the amount, it's very small. And also in terms of the duration, it's very short. For example, you can give some kind of credit subsidies to the early investment, but only to the earlier investment. And those kind of subsidy is one time. And you can also give some kind of tax incentive. If you invest in this kind of target sectors, you can have tax exemption for 3 years, or you can reduce the tax rate, to half for another 2 or 3 years. And those kind are time limited, and the quantity is very small. But if you look into the protection and subsidies to the comparative advantage defining sectors, as we see in the import substitution strategy or the heavy industry oriented development strategy in the planning economy. First, the subsidy is so huge. And secondly, is and the never ending. It's all, and so here is the so-called, the quantitative difference make qualitative difference. Now, the small quantity so limited of time is an incentive. But if the quantity is so huge and the time is so long, then you are going to create the issue of ransaking and capture all those kind of problems.
Yeah, so what you really are advocating for is a dual approach, a parallel approach, which is also part of your theoretical argumentation that we can forget about the issue of neoclassical economics, but it's really one part that is at least freer, one part of the economy that is freer, that competes globally, and we should start with light manufacturing. But then you have another part of the economy that is subsidized, protected. You can also use financial repression, state intervention, invest ahead of demand, part of the economy that do not follow neoclassical economics, so to speak. And gradually, there should be some kind of transitioning to an eventual ideal state where the whole economy could be seen as a free economy operating according to neoclassical assumptions.
Here is very true, and I hear that because the neoclassical analysis in general, they do not talk about structural transformation. They only talk about resource allocation within one structure, right? And I think there's no structural transformation. There's no those kind of externality for the first movers, and those kind of necessity for the government to improve the infrastructure and institution. And by that, certainly, you can allow the market just to have allocation of resources. In the real world, there's always structural transformation.
That's what I wanted to just say. I mean, I have some problems with the neoclassical approach. I don't think it is really real in many ways.
No, right. And actually, also, if you look into the advanced country, they subsidize R&D, right? And they need to subsidize R&D because their technology is already on the global technology frontier. And if they want to have a dynamic growth, they need to have a technological innovation. But technology innovation in a high-income country means invention. But if you want to have invention, it's very risky. So you need to give the incentive to the people so they give a patent. And innovation rely on two things. One is research in the best technology and the development of new product, new technology. For the development of new product and technology, the incentive is a patent. But research, basic research is a public good. And so the firm will not do it. So under the kind of situation, actually, the high-income country, they always subsidize the basic research. So similar to the developing country, the difference is that the area the government plays the role will be different for country at a different stage of development. But the government always need to play those kind of proactive facilitation role to overcome the externality issue, to overcome the market value issue.
Yeah, so even though you brand your theory a neoclassical approach, you still recognize that it could be critiqued.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you very much for that elaboration. I think I have just one or two questions left and we have to end. I think we're already ahead of time, so please let me know if I can ask you one or two more questions.
So go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So let me see which one should I take? Yeah, let's take another question about Ethiopia or perhaps China, Africa. Yeah, so the Chinese leadership has stated that China-Ethiopia relations is a model for South-South cooperation, and logically so as well for China-Africa relations. So how is the China-Ethiopia relationship a model? Is it a focus on manufacturing, or is there some other dimension to this model? And how do you envision the future of China's relationship with various African countries?
Well, China is an emerging, donor country. And when China, try to make the development support to the, recipient country, I think the purpose is not just to give money. The purpose is to help them to transform. So they can, have this kind of internal driver for their development. And as I mentioned earlier, to be successful in this kind of transformation, you need to turn the country from an agrarian-based economy to the industrialized economy. And for the industrialized economy, you need to follow your comparative advantages, but you also need to improve the infrastructures. And for China with Ethiopia and China with the African country, that China, in the cooperation with African country, China support the infrastructure improvement in African country. For example, in Ethiopia, to build a railway from Addis Ababa to Djibouti, and that is an infrastructure investment. But infrastructure investment, to be helpful, you also need to help, develop the industry. So China also help build up the special economic zone in Ethiopia, and so they can employ, they can develop industry to employ workers, and also to export the goods. And not only so, if you want to, develop industries and with the employment, you also need to improve the education of the worker and so on. So all this, cooperation, development cooperation, try to help the African country to transform. And Ethiopia is one of the country that receive this kind of support, and they also, make this kind of support into a quick realization of their fast development. And you can see Ethiopia, in the past, 20 years, the average annual growth rate is almost 10% per year. It's almost the same as China and the fastest growing country in Africa and in the world. And as I mentioned, if Ethiopia can be successful, it will provide experiences, confidence, and aspiration for other African countries.
So even though we might disagree how to achieve this structural transformation, the model, the China-Ethiopia relation as a model, the emphasis should be put on structural transformation.
Yeah. Structural transformation for job generation, for export creation.
Yeah, very good. I like that. It's important to have good slogans.
Yeah,
very nice. Okay, you allowed me to ask one more question.
go ahead.
Yeah. So I will take that opportunity. So given that you met with President Xi Jinping to help with the development of the 14th five-year plan for 2021 and 2025, what specific policies did you advocate? And do you see a reflection of your theory in Beijing's policy priorities? In other words, does President Xi heed your advice?
Well, I'm delighted to see many of my theory and recommendation are reflected in the Chinese government policy, including the 14th five-year plan. For example, I always argue if you want to have a very dynamic economic growth, you need to follow your comparative advantages in your industrial upgrading, in your technological innovations. And to make that possible, to make that work well, you need to have an efficient market, but you also need to have an efficient, proactive facilitation state. Those ideas are reflected in the Chinese government policies, and including the 14th five-year plan. And also, for example, certainly, we need to have, we want to have growth, but we also want to improve the income distribution. And I always argue, if we want to have a growth with improvement of income distribution, the best way is to follow your competitive advantages in the process of economic development. Because if you follow your competitive advantages, then you can achieve equity and growth in the primary distribution. The reason is that, we see that poor people, they get their income mainly from their labor employment, because labor force is the only asset that they have. But rich people, they obtain their income mostly from capital. Okay. So if you follow your competitive advantage in development for a developing country, certainly they will develop labor-intensive industry, adopt labor-intensive technology, because at the time their income is low and therefore will be their competitive advantages. By this, they can generate the largest possible jobs. And also the benefit pool with a poor growth. Equally important, as we already mentioned, if you follow your comparative advantages in a market economy with a facilitation state, the economy can be very competitive, grow very fast. Capital will be accumulated very quickly. And so you will turn the economy from relative abundant in level to relatively abundant in capitals. And with change in this endowment structure, the wage rate will increase very quickly. And so the poor people's asset will become increasingly valuable. But at the same time, the return to capital will relatively decline. So the asset owned by the rich people will become less valuable. But that certainly income distribution will be improved. And that is the reason why in East Asian economies, in their rapid catching up stages, they achieve equity with growth with equity. And through this kind of efficiency and equity in the primary distribution. And that will also allow the government to do more secondary distribution. Because if you grow very fast, certainly the government revenue will increase very fast. At the same time, if you follow your comparative advantages, the government will not have to subsidize the non-viable form in the sector which go against your comparative advantages. And so the government not only has more resources, the government will have more resources to improve the secondary distribution by improved education, by investing in necessary infrastructure and so on to narrow the urban-rural gap or the regional disparities. And the government will have more resources to take care of employment or the older people or underprivileged people. So, and those the ideas that I have been advocating in my new structural economics, and I also like to see, I'm also glad to see those ideas has been reflected in the Chinese government policies.
Okay, thank you very much for the interview, Professor Lin. A true honor to have you here, and thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and ideas.
And I thank you very much for me to have this conversation, to share my idea with you and to discuss all those very important issues for China, for Africa, and also for the world.
I appreciate it. All the very best.
Yeah,
bye-bye.
The same to you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, the same.